Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera. I know in my last video I promised I would be making more camera videos shortly, and I apologize that it's taken me so long to make another video, but it's been very busy here over the last 4 or 5 weeks. Besides the fact that the school year is ending and we have a lot of stuff to do for the end of the school year and kids getting ready for summer school and summer camp, it's been quite busy at my stores. I've sold quite a lot of cameras. Thank you very much for those of you who have bought cameras from me. And it's taking a lot of time to, of course, process the orders and get everything shipped out. Especially nowadays when the shipping process is a little bit more complicated than it otherwise is. One of my customers asked me to explain the shipping process here a little bit and some of the complications which are involved. An interesting thing which has happened since due to the pandemic is I guess the distribution of vaccines to different places and people getting vaccinated. Here when the vaccines were first coming out, it seems that some unscrupulous people here in Japan had made contacts with people on the Asian mainland to produce, I guess, counterfeit vaccines. And as it would be kind of obvious to, I guess, customs in Europe and America to inspect packages coming from this country, they decide to kind of sneak these into Japan, repackage them, and then export them from here. And this caused a lot of complication here. Japanese customs is probably the most, I guess, sophisticated in the world, and they caught on to this scam rather quickly. But as a result, it's made it a little bit more difficult to export things from here. And not necessarily more difficult, it's just more inspection and time is required. So nowadays, I can no longer put my cameras and such into boxes and put the labels on them and ship them off. I have to leave the boxes unsealed, and they have to be inspected by both the shipping company and customs, which kind of incurs something of a delay. Not so much a time delay, but a delay in the time it takes for tracking information to be available, because packages cannot be tracked until they are sealed. Once they are sealed, the information is sent off, and then packages can be tracked. So this is causing a few days delay, and this is why, though I do upload a tracking number usually rather quickly, it may take a few days before you can actually track your package. So that's a little bit of a story about what's going on here. Oh, and also additional paperwork is required. New tax laws in Europe and other places have made it a little more difficult. More paperwork is now required to export to these places. So that doesn't necessarily cause any delays, but it does cause some more complication in the process. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started with the subject of today's video, and this is going to be about the Koniflex twin lens reflex camera. For those of you who are new to my channel, I sell vintage Japanese cameras at my online store, which is called JapanVintageCamera.com. I also have an Etsy store, and it is also called Japan Vintage Camera. If you'd like to buy this vintage Japanese camera or another, please visit one of my stores. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. The cameras which I list in my online store are a little bit less expensive than the ones in my Etsy store. Mainly because of the difference in fees. Etsy tends to charge rather large fees for sales, and of course I don't have to pay sales to fees to my own store. So keep that in mind. And anything that you see for sale in my Etsy store, I can also sell in my online store. So if you see something available in one store but not in the other, please contact me, and I can go ahead and list it for you. Anyway. The subject of today's video is, as I said, the Koniflex twin lens reflex camera, which was introduced in Japan in about 1952 and sold until about 1956 or 1957. This is one of the more uncommon twin lens reflex cameras in Japan, and the reason it is so uncommon was largely due to the price. When this camera was released in 1952, the price on it was nearly goman yen, or 50,000 yen. And that was quite a large amount of money back in those days. Even today in 2021, 50,000 yen can buy you a decent SLR camera, DSLR camera and a lens. So you can imagine how much this actually cost back in the early 1950s. In those days, things like cameras and televisions and things like that were so expensive that few people could afford to pay cash for them. So if you were to buy one of these cameras, you could finance it through Konica for 2 or 3 years and make monthly payments on it. The reason this camera was so expensive is largely due to the quality. This is an incredibly high quality camera, and Konica cut no corners or spared no expense in the design or manufacture of this camera. Even today, this is I guess nearly 70 years after 1952, this camera is still in quite good condition. The paint, the metal, the lens, everything in it is still rather pristine. It's held up quite well over time. And most of the cameras, these Konicas which I come across, are usually still in good working condition. And an obvious sign to the quality of the camera is looking at the coverings on the sides and back. Konica used genuine leather instead of the vinyl or what do they call, vulcanite, which was used on, I guess, other cameras, or commonly used on other cameras. And the quality of the optics is really amazing. You have to remember that in 1952, Konica was already a very old manufacturer of cameras. They had been in the photography business for some, I don't know, 60, 70 years by the time this camera was produced. So they were quite capable of producing excellent cameras. Let's go ahead and take a look at the features and functions and controls and how to use the Konica Flex or Koniflex. This one is quite interesting in that it includes the original lens cap on it. And it's interesting, it's kind of a blued metal finish like you would find on something like a high quality firearm. And another thing which this camera has is the original filter, which is rather scarce because the Konica filter or Koni filter was made for specific cameras. And while it's not so difficult to find them for cameras like the Konica 35, the 1, 2, and 3 series, it's a little bit harder to find them for the TLR. So this is kind of an odd size. So to be able to find one of these cameras with the original filter is really interesting. And a good thing about having it with the original filter is you notice, or you kind of understand, that the lens will probably be in better shape because it was protected by the filter. The Koniflex, it had a rather unique lens among twin lens reflex cameras. It featured an 85mm f3.5 lens rather than the 80mm or 75mm, which was a little more common. The benefit of this lens compared to the others is that in the medium format, the 75 or 80mm lens is something of a wide angle lens. And if you shoot cameras like the Mamiya Press or other ones, the 75mm lens is definitely a wide angle lens. 80mm is less of a wide angle lens, and 85mm gets you a little bit closer to what would be more of a portrait length lens, which would be somewhere around 100 or between 100 and 120 millimeters. So if you're taking pictures of people, like portraits or such, you're going to get a better I guess better results with one of these cameras, especially if you're shooting up close. Say you're taking a head and shoulders shot of someone. For anything further than that, of course, any of these focal lengths is fine, everything will look fine. But the closer you get, the more distorted your image will be if you're using something like a 75 or 80mm lens. This lens is a hexagon lens, and it is a 5-element lens. And according to my Japanese sources, it's kind of a copy of the Voigtlander Heliar design, which is rather unique in TLR cameras, and produces wonderful results. Konica used extremely good quality glass when they manufactured lenses, and they are not prone to the haze or fogging, which is common in some of the medium format lenses of the 1950s. The lens on top is what is called a view hexar. The hexar and hexagon, Konica used a couple of different names for their different style of lenses. The hexar lens was the more, I guess, a simple lens or less expensive lens, and commonly found on a lot of Konica cameras, whereas the hexagon lens was usually a higher end lens found on the higher quality cameras. That's not always necessarily true. A lot of the hexar lenses were amazing performance, like the ones which came on, say, the Pearl 3 and Pearl 4 cameras. The Hexar lens on the top here, the View Hexar, is slightly faster to allow more light through the lens to make it a little bit easier for you to focus. Let's go ahead and take a look at the top of the camera, and here we have the focusing hood, and to open it up you simply pull back on this latch and the hood pops open like so. And the first thing you notice when you look inside, that instead of having a flat ground glass like you would find in, say, a large format camera or a Rolleiflex or pretty much every other medium format camera, this camera here actually has a proper focusing screen, which is rather convex on the back and flat on the front. And this allows for a more precise and better focusing image. There's a focusing loop which you open by pushing the bottom of this door on the front. This is the front of the sports finder, and it pops open like so. A good symbol of a high quality twin lens reflex camera is a very large baffle around the focusing loop. This prevents excess light from getting on the focusing screen and allows you to see the image more clearly and to focus more precisely. As I said, the Koniflex has a sports finder. You can see the rear opening for the sports finder on the back here and on the front. The Koniflex works opposite to most other twin lens reflex cameras. In most twin lens reflex cameras, you push the top of this panel downward to open the sports finder. With the Koniflex, it's opposite. You simply push it upward until you expose the sports finder. The sports finder is easy to use provided you're shooting at something which is at infinity distance. With the sports finder up, you cannot focus the camera, so you kind of have to either do a scale focus system, or scale focus, or you have to just shoot at things which are at infinity. Now, back in the day, a lot of famous photographs were taken of sports using a twin lens reflex camera, and the trick to doing it was first to use the sports finder, second to have your objects at infinity focus, and third to use the fastest shutter speed you could get away with at the time, so as to be able to freeze the action. So the Koniflex has a maximum shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, and if you're using ISO 400 speed film, you can freeze the action pretty well in it. To close the sports finder, simply push down a little bit on the focusing loop, and that will cause the sports finder to close, and then push the loop the rest of the way to close it, and then simply push back the focusing hood. On the side here we have the film winding knob, and next to that we have the focusing dial. Now, one thing you have to be very careful with when you're using a Koniflex is to understand that this camera focuses past infinity, and it does that to be able to fold the lenses further back and make the camera more compact for storage. That makes it easier to fit in a bag or in the original case, but it can make things a little complicated if you are unused to these cameras and are trying to get it to work, because if you have the lens focused all the way inward and you try to operate the shutter, you find that it doesn't work. If the lens is not focused to at least the infinity focal length, the shutter will not operate. I've moved it to infinity and I push the button, and now the shutter works fine. Let's go ahead and move to the other side of the camera. Here we have a shoe for mounting a flash gun. If you're going to use a flash with this camera, you have to get an adapter for the Kodak flash socket. You can get adapters which will allow you to use a PC sync socket, or if you're using a vintage bulb flash, it may be the Kodak style already. We have here the knobs which you pull out to load the film or take up spool. And these are kind of like the higher quality ones which you find on a Mamiya or Yashica camera. If you pull them out and turn them a little bit, they lock in the outward position, which allows you to put the film spools in easily. And then you just turn it until it slides back in. Here you have the film counter window. And in front here you have this kind of odd little button thing. And this is a double exposure control, which allows you to take multiple exposures on the same frame of film. That's just kind of a... Oh, that's a big bug there. This is kind of a feature which was popular in the 1950s. We didn't have much in the way of being able to like digitally manipulate images and things like that. And simple tricks like double exposure or whatever were really considered, I guess, trendy or useful at the time. We'll go ahead and take a look at the back of the camera, and here we have a simple exposure computer. And What this does is it allows you to take a look at the different situations here. It has a list of apertures on the top and a list of suggested shutter speeds for these given situations for a particular speed film. The standard film speed of these days was ISO 25 or 50, and ISO 100 was considered a high speed film in those days. So if you're using this exposure guide on the back, what does it say here? Okay, AED settings. Okay, for normal film. And ASA for Weston 20. So it also gives you an adjustment on the bottom for making a double exposure. So by taking double exposures, you don't get two exposures but overexpose the film. So quite an interesting guide on the back. On the bottom here we have a standard 1/4" tripod socket, and we have kind of what I guess Konica called the improved door latch system for the film door. An interesting thing on the Koniflex camera, which is different from every other TLR camera which I have come across, is this film pressure plate system. Now, if you look at pretty much every twin lens reflex camera, you're going to notice that all of them have the same basic 2 rollers here. A Rolleiflex will usually have 3, and you feed the film kind of through the 2 in the back, and that's kind of like the automatic thing which starts the frame counter for a Rolleiflex. This camera here uses this kind of a roller here for operating the film counter. But you have these rollers here, and what I also notice, or what you'll see, is it has 2 more rollers on either side of the pressure plate. And the idea for this system, or the intention of it, was to get the film perfectly flat on the pressure plate. A problem which we've always had in film photography is keeping the film flat. This is a really big issue, and camera manufacturers have done wonders when it comes to making precise lenses and optics and precision focusing, but those things aren't really worth much unless you can keep the film flat. And cameras like the, I guess Olympus 6, the folding medium format camera, Olympus was quite happy with the performance of their D Zuiko lens, but they had trouble getting it to perform well in the camera because they could not get the film to sit as flat as they would like. So eventually they were able to get a very good and flat film surface, but not to the same extent as this particular Koniflex camera. If you look at the design, with the 2 rollers here, the 2 outer rollers, and the film counter roller here, you'll find this exact same design on the Mamiya Press roll film backs, which were introduced at a later date, I should say. And the Mamiya Press has the reputation of having the flattest, or the system which holds the film the flattest, to get the best, I guess, potential out of your images. So among TLR cameras, you're probably going to get really good performance out of this camera, especially when you consider the quality of the Hexanon lens. One thing I'm going to do with this camera, which I haven't done with other ones in a few moments, is show you how to properly load the film. If you're curious about how to do that, please hang on to the end of the video. Before I get to that, I'm going to discuss how to operate the aperture and shutter speed on the camera. This camera has kind of an older style or simple style system, which we find on early TLR cameras, with a kind of like the lens on a large format camera, with the aperture and shutter controls just right on the shutter itself. We have this ring here, which is the shutter speed ring, and we have a range of shutter speeds from bulb and just 1 second all the way up to 1/400th of a second. And on top of that, or to the side of that, we have the lever which you use to operate the aperture. And you can see both the numbers here on this side quite clearly if you look down from the top of the camera. Another thing which this camera has, which is a really interesting feature, is a kind of combined shutter cocking and self-timer lever. And the self-timer lever, I should say button, is this little red plastic button right here next to my finger. To operate the self-timer in this camera, you have to depress this button and then cock the shutter as far as it will go. If you have this button depressed, it will cock farther than normal, and the additional distance is the distance needed to operate the self-timer. I'm not going to give you an example of that right now because the self-timer in this particular camera is really sluggish. The shutter works fine, as you can see, if I focus it out to infinity. But the self-timer is really sluggish. I've got to clean it out. An interesting thing about the shutter system on this is it has two ways to actuate the shutter. To charge the shutter, you push this lever on the bottom to the right if you're standing behind the camera and simply release it. And to fire the shutter, you can push the shutter release button here, or you can pull this charging lever just the opposite direction and the shutter will fire. There are threads on the bottom of the shutter release button here, and this allows you to use an earlier style cable release. So these cable releases are a little bit hard to find nowadays. You can find them on eBay and vintage camera shops and such like that. Or you can find the adapters, and with an adapter you can just screw the adapter on and attach a cable release to the camera. Alright, so I said I was going to show you how to load film in this camera, and I'll go ahead and start. I'll go ahead and pop open the film door here, and the first thing you're going to do when you are loading a medium format camera is to make sure you have a take-up spool and it is in the take-up position. I came across an old exposed roll of Fuji Neopan SS film, which was probably made a few years before I was born. I'm not a young man, so that gives you an idea of how old this is. To load the film, the first thing we need to do is, usually these are sealed with a piece of tape. So take off the tape so the paper backing will come loose. First thing I do when I get a new roll of medium format film is I bend the paper tab backwards like this and push it down so there's a nice sharp crease, which you can probably see here now. Then I'll go ahead and pull out the pin here, set the film canister inside, I wiggle it around so the pin pops back inward. Then I'll pull the paper backing over the film chamber, and I'm going to feed it into the slot on the take-up spool. There's a wide slot here. The end of the paper goes in there, and I push it in until the crease is right against the edge of the slot, and then I will slowly turn the winding dial, but I will keep my thumb on the paper and kind of push it along a little bit as I wind the winding knob, and that's to make sure that the slot and the take-up spool actually catches on the paper. The paper is a little slippery, and it's quite possible for it to pull out as you are winding the winding knob, and if that happens you won't be able to advance the film. More than once I've thought I was taking photos with one of these cameras and found out that it was actually just you know, that the wheel was just turning and the film wasn't advancing. That's quite annoying when that happens. So once you've got it going, what you need to do next is keep winding until you can see this wide arrow here. The film you are using will have different kinds of backing paper, different colors. It could be black like this, it could be yellow, it could be white, but pretty much all of it will have this, this arrow here, and this is kind of like the start line. And most cameras will have indicators where you line up these arrows to make sure that you have the proper starting point. On the Koniflex, the two arrows are right here on the bottom. You'll see these two red dots. On other cameras, you'll sometimes find them in the middle. Sometimes they are painted red, sometimes they are painted white, sometimes they are not painted at all, and some cameras simply don't have them. And if it doesn't have the marks, I will usually wind it until it's somewhere around, say, the bottom third of the film chamber, and I think that's safe enough to go ahead and start. So I'll go ahead and wind up until the arrows are lined up with the red dots. Then close the film door. Make sure that it's latched properly, that the pin in the door is in the center of the catch and not off center. Another thing which I've had happen to me is not properly closing the film door and exposing a lot of my images accidentally. And yeah, once it's in, you simply wind the film, and you keep winding the film until the number 1 shows up in the window here. Then you, using your light meter or smartphone app or whatever, you will set your shutter speed and aperture for the conditions. Today it's a nice sunny day, and if I were shooting 200 speed film in the direct sunshine, I would set my shutter speed to 1/200th of a second. and set my aperture to f/16. Being this is a medium format camera, you can use smaller apertures than you would use on a 35mm camera without the risk of diffraction. Then I would pop open the focusing hood. I would lift up the focusing loop. Then I would probably charge the shutter first. Then I would compose, focus, and then focus it out to at least infinity. Then shoot. And of course, I happen to touch the self-timer there, so that's kind of my fault that it's not shooting. But anyway, that's the way it's supposed to be done. And when of course the shutter is supposed to fire at the same time. But anyway, that's it for my video about the Koniflex twin lens reflex camera. I haven't worked on this camera yet, which is why it still has a few of the problems, which you may have noticed as I've been trying to give a demonstration of it. I hope to have it cleaned up and working within a few days and listed for sale on my stores. I have a few more cameras that I'm going to be listing shortly, so if you're interested in buying this camera or another one, please check out my stores. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.